Daniel never imagined that his mouth would be the reason for his death sentence, but that was exactly how things were going that day. When he stood inside the great throne hall of the Blue Queen, he had been dragged there after the patrol ship captured him wandering on the barren plains outside their city. He had no weapons, no translator device, no proper introduction prepared. He was just a human lost in a world that did not know humans existed. The aliens marched him through the gates with their long spears pointed toward his back, and the entire crowd whispered among themselves. They had never seen a creature like him before. He looked weaker than them, shorter, soft-skinned, and yet his eyes carried a stubborn shine as if he belonged there. The guards shoved him to his knees before the throne. The chamber stretched high. Above him, ceilings carved with glowing symbols, and in the center sat the queen herself. Her body shimmered with deep shades of sapphire, and her crown extended like wings of crystal light. Her eyes glowed in piercing silver, cold and sharp as knives. She leaned forward, curious, while her advisors whispered warnings. They told her this creature might be dangerous because unknown things often carried danger. But the queen only stared at Daniel as though she wanted to study him like some strange insect. Daniel felt the heavy silence pressing against him. He had faced tough situations before, times when survival depended on quick wit, but never like this. He was exhausted, starving, and cornered. When the queen demanded his name in her strange language, the translation orb at her side repeated her words in rough English. Daniel swallowed hard and answered simply, giving his name. She tilted her head, observing every detail about him. Her people stood motionless around the hall, waiting for her judgment. Daniel felt nervous, his heart racing so loudly that he thought even the aliens might hear it. His mind scrambled for some way to appear less threatening, maybe even friendly. That was when he noticed her skin. It was blue, not just a pale tint but bright like painted cobalt, almost glowing under the torchlight. The image of a cartoon from his childhood flickered in his mind. He remembered those little blue characters who sang songs and annoyed the taller one among them. The thought slipped out of his mouth before he could stop it. "You look like a Smurf." The word echoed in the hall. Silence fell thicker than stone. The aliens gasped, some recoiling as if Daniel had uttered a curse. The queen froze in her throne, her eyes narrowing into a dangerous gleam. She did not understand the word, but she understood tone. She understood insult. Her advisors whispered frantically into her ears, and the orb tried to make sense of the phrase. The translation came out broken, something like tiny blue mockery. The hall erupted in outrage. The queen rose slowly, her gown shifting like flowing water, and every guard in the chamber knelt to her in fear. She glared at Daniel as if he had spat in her face. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and merciless. She declared that no one insulted the queen and lived to tell the story. She spoke of dishonor, of how her throne demanded respect above all, and how ridicule was punishable by death. Her voice grew louder until it filled every corner of the chamber, and finally she pointed her long finger at Daniel and delivered the sentence, execution. Daniel's mouth went dry. His knees weakened, but he forced himself not to collapse. He wanted to argue, to explain that Smurfs were not enemies, that it was only a joke from his world, but the translator could never capture humor. The concept of laughter and mockery blended into one offensive blur for these aliens. What had been a nervous slip for him became a grave insult in their culture. Guards seized his arms and dragged him backward while the crowd shouted their approval of the queen's judgment. Inside Daniel's head a storm raged. He could not believe he was going to die because of one word. It felt absurd, like some twisted comedy. Yet when he looked around at the sea of angry alien faces, he knew it was real. Their eyes carried the same rage humans had when their pride was wounded. Pride could be deadlier than any weapon. He tried to speak again as they pulled him through the archway, shouting that he had not meant harm, that he respected her, that it was a mistake. But the translator twisted his words into a weak plea and laughter at the same time. The guards struck his back with their spears and silenced him. His feet scraped across the polished floor as he was dragged deeper into the palace prison. As the heavy doors slammed behind him, the sound echoed like the closing of fate itself. He sat in the corner of his cell, breathing hard, staring at the strange glowing walls. His mind would not rest. He thought about Earth, about how harmless the word Smurf truly was, and how unfair it seemed that something so silly could mark the end of his life. Yet he knew the truth. Here in this world, he had insulted royalty. And in every world, royal pride was unforgiving. Still, he could not let despair take him completely. Something in him refused to give up. Maybe it was the human instinct to survive. At all costs, maybe it was the stubbornness to never let a joke be the final word of his life. He whispered to himself that he had to find a way, that this could not be the end. The queen might have sentenced him to death, but he was Daniel. And he had survived worse than this before. The night inside the cell was long and restless. The guards outside barely moved, their blue armor glowing under the dim light. Daniel pressed his head against the cold wall and wondered how he would escape, how he would change the queen's mind, or at least delay his execution. He thought again of the word Smurf and almost laughed to himself, the absurdity of it cutting through his fear. It was madness to die because of a cartoon, but perhaps madness was his only weapon left. When dawn came, the guards unlocked his cell and pulled him to his feet. The chains clinked against the floor as they dragged him back toward the throne chamber. Daniel felt the weight of doom pressing on his shoulders, yet inside his chest burned a spark. He did not know how, but he would not let the word Smurf be his death sentence. He would turn it into something else, something that could save him. And with that thought, he stepped back into the queen's presence, awaiting the next move in the dangerous game that had begun with a single slip of his tongue. Daniel was forced back into the great throne chamber where the queen sat upon her shining seat of crystal light, and the crowd gathered in restless waves of sound. The memory of his careless insult still burned through the air like smoke after fire. Every alien in the chamber stared at him as if they were watching a condemned man take his final steps. He was shoved to his knees again, and the weight of the chains pressed heavily against his wrists. The guards stood like stone statues around him, waiting only for the command to carry out the will of their ruler. The queen's eyes did not leave him. She had not forgotten the insult, and her voice rang with a sharp edge when she spoke. She declared before her people that the human was guilty of dishonoring the throne. Her words carried through the chamber in clear rhythm, and the translation orb repeated them in his language, with a mechanical voice that only added to the terror. The sentence was death, and it would be public so that all would witness what happened. To anyone foolish enough to mock the dignity of their queen, the crowd roared with approval, and the sound shook through Daniel's bones. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth as he listened to them celebrate his end. He tried to speak, tried to explain that he had meant no harm, but the guards forced his head down. The translator twisted his protest into something weak and confusing, so that instead of sounding honest, it made him appear desperate and pathetic. The queen lifted her hand for silence and then announced that the execution would take place at dawn 3 days from now in the grand arena. Until then, he would remain in chains under heavy guard. Daniel's heart pounded. 3 days. That was all the time he had to figure out a way to live. He was dragged back out of the throne hall and down long corridors where the walls glowed faintly with alien light. The prison door opened with a heavy scrape, and he was thrown back inside. The chains rattled as the guards locked them to a hook in the floor, leaving him barely able to move more than a few steps. When the doors slammed shut, again silence filled the cell, and Daniel felt the crushing weight of what had just happened. He sat there staring at the strange markings carved into the walls. His mind ran wild trying to understand the alien sense of honor. To them, respect was everything. A single wrong word was not small or funny, but a wound against the pride of the throne. He cursed himself for his foolish mouth and the way his nervousness had slipped into humor. Yet at the same time, a strange thought stirred in him. If his joke had angered the queen so much, then maybe jokes could also become a weapon. Maybe humor was not only weakness. Maybe it was strength in disguise. That night he did not sleep much. The cold stone pressed against his back while he listened to the faint movements of guards outside the cell. At times he thought he heard faint whispers or laughter muffled quickly, but he could not be sure. Perhaps some of the aliens had found the insult amusing, but they dared not admit it for fear of the queen. The idea gave Daniel a strange spark of hope. Maybe not everyone wanted him dead. On the second day, a servant entered his cell carrying food. The servant was younger than the guards, smaller in size, and her eyes held a nervous curiosity rather than hatred. She placed the plate near him and hesitated as if she wanted to speak. Daniel looked at her and asked quietly if she knew what Smurf meant. The translator, orb at her belt, worked slowly to repeat his question in her language. She tilted her head and shook it. She admitted softly that she did not know the word, but she remembered the way he had said it, and for some reason she found it funny even though she could not explain why. She warned him in a whisper that the queen never forgives mockery. Daniel studied her face and saw sincerity in her eyes. He told her that humans laugh at things when they are afraid. It was not disrespect but survival. He spoke simply, knowing the translator could not handle complex explanations. The servant frowned at first, but then gave a tiny smile as if the thought made sense to her. She quickly gathered the plate and hurried away before the guards noticed her delay. Daniel leaned back against the wall and thought hard about her words and her reaction. If he could reach even one alien mind with the meaning of humor, perhaps he could reach more. On the third day, the guards returned to bring him from the cell. The clinking of his chains echoed through the hallway as they led him up the stone steps toward the blinding light of the arena. He felt his throat dry with fear, yet his mind sharpened with determination. He remembered every story of humans standing before impossible odds and still finding a way to endure. The alien crowd filled the seats in endless rows, their blue faces watching with cold fascination. In the center of the arena stood the execution stage, and at its peak was the queen herself, radiant and merciless. She raised her hand and the crowd fell silent. Her voice rang through the air like thunder. She told them all that this human had broken the sacred honor of the throne by insulting her. She said today he would pay the price with his life, and his death would be a warning for all to see. The crowd cheered, and the guards forced Daniel onto the stage, chains rattling as they shoved him to his knees once more. Queen looked down at him with disdain and asked if he had any final words before his execution. The translator orb repeated the question in his language, and for a moment, Daniel felt the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on him. His body trembled, but inside his chest something defiant rose. He knew he could beg or cry, but that would only give her the satisfaction of breaking him. Instead, he thought about what made him human, what made him different from them. His ability to turn fear into laughter. He lifted his head and met the queen's eyes. The words began to form on his lips, not words of apology but something else, something daring. The crowd leaned forward, waiting to hear the last breath of a man about to die. Daniel realized that in the next moment he could seal his fate or change everything. And as he opened his mouth to speak, the arena held its breath, caught between silence and storm. Daniel stood there with chains pressing against his wrists and ankles while the great arena thundered with the sound of alien voices demanding his end. The queen's silver eyes cut into him like blades, and the guards waited only for her signal. His mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, each more desperate than the last, and yet he refused to bow. He had been given a chance to speak, and that chance was all he needed, because sometimes one word at the right moment could change everything. He cleared his throat and raised his voice so the translator orb could carry it across the arena. He did not beg for mercy, and he did not curse his fate. Instead, he spoke of the moment when he had first seen the Queen. He said he had seen her skin, and it reminded him of a story from his own world, a story of small blue beings who lived with joy and laughter. The crowd murmured in confusion while the orb twisted the word Smurf again into broken translations. Yet Daniel pressed forward with energy. He told them that in his world laughter was not a weapon, but a shield, that humans laughed when they were afraid, laughed when they were hurt, laughed even when they stood at the edge of death. The crowd listened, though they did not fully understand. Some frowned, some tilted their heads, and some struggled to hold back smiles that fought to rise on their faces. Daniel felt the shift in the air and realized that the servant girl had been right. There were aliens here who felt the pull of humor, even if they feared showing it. He continued, raising his voice, speaking of how laughter could unite the weak and the strong, how it reminded humans that fear could never fully control them. The Queen grew restless in her throne. Her fingers tightened around the armrest, and her cold eyes narrowed further. She saw the subtle changes in her people, and she did not like it. She struck her staff against the floor and demanded silence. She declared that this human was mocking them again, turning his last words into another insult. But before she could command his death, a sound broke through the crowd. It was soft at first, then louder, the sound of laughter. One alien let out a chuckle that spread like fire across dry grass. More followed, and soon the arena trembled not with anger, but with an unfamiliar sound. Laughter rolled through the seats, uncontrollable and bright. It confused them and frightened them at the same time. For many of them, it was the first time. They had felt such a release of tension, the first time they had allowed joy to rise in a place ruled by fear. Daniel felt the chains on his body, but for the first time since his capture, he did not feel powerless. He looked up at the Queen and spoke again, telling her that he had not meant to dishonor her, but to show her something greater than pride. He told her that fear made rulers cruel, but laughter made rulers wise. His words were simple, yet they struck the crowd deeply because they saw the truth reflected in their own reaction. The Queen rose to her feet, her long gown flowing like liquid sapphire, and the arena fell silent again. Her anger was clear, yet beneath it a flicker of doubt could be seen. She had ruled with fear for many years, and never once had her people dared to laugh in her presence. Now, because of one foolish human, her authority was shaken. She lifted her staff high, and for a moment, Daniel thought she would strike him down on the spot. He braced himself, ready for the end, yet inside he knew he had planted a seed. Even if he died, the memory of this day would never leave the minds of those who had laughed. The Queen lowered her staff slowly and signaled for the guards to pull Daniel back into the cells. She did not speak further, and the crowd whispered in confusion. The execution was delayed, though no reason was given. Daniel stumbled as the guards dragged him away, his body aching but his spirit alive with the thought that he had survived one more day. He had turned the arena into something the Queen could not control, and that meant he still had a chance. Back in the cell, he collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. The servant girl appeared once more with food and water. Her eyes shone with a secret excitement. She whispered to him that the people could not stop talking about what happened, that some even dared to laugh in the streets where once silence ruled. She told him that he had changed something inside them. Daniel listened carefully and realized that his survival was no longer just about him. If he played his next move wisely, he could change the fate of this entire society. But he also knew the danger had doubled. The Queen would not forgive him easily, and if she felt her throne slipping, she would not hesitate to end him in the cruelest way possible. He had to be clever. He had to make her believe that his words did not weaken her, but offered her something new. That thought stayed with him as he lay in the cell waiting for the next day. He thought of how humans had always been underestimated, how people saw them as fragile, foolish, or weak, yet it was their humor and defiance that kept them alive through endless trials. The next morning, the guards came again. They marched him not to the arena but to a smaller chamber filled with advisors and the queen herself. She studied him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Her advisors argued in hushed voices, some calling for his immediate death, others warning that killing him after what had happened could spark unrest. Daniel saw the division and knew this was his chance. He stood tall despite the chains and spoke clearly. He told her that laughter did not weaken rulers but made them unforgettable. He said fear could make people obey, but joy could make them loyal. The queen's eyes narrowed as she considered his words. She demanded to know why she should not end him where he stood. Daniel looked straight at her and answered with the only truth he had. Because if she killed him now, her people would remember the day they laughed, not the day she executed an outsider. They would remember the man who mocked her and survived long enough to make them feel alive. Silence stretched through the chamber. The advisors whispered again, some furious, others uneasy. Daniel waited with his heart pounding in his chest. This was not just about survival anymore. This was about proving that humans were more than fragile beings lost in space. They carried with them something no weapon could crush. And as the queen rose from her throne once again, her decision hovered in the air like a blade about to fall. Daniel stood in the chamber with the weight of chains digging into his wrists while the queen's piercing gaze studied him as if she was deciding whether he was an insect to crush or a rare beast to preserve. Her advisors crowded around her throne whispering sharply among themselves. Some called him a danger to the throne and demanded his execution without delay, while others warned her that ending him now, after what had happened in the arena, might weaken her authority instead of strengthening it. The queen raised her hand and the advisors fell silent. She commanded the guards to bring Daniel forward into the open circle of the chamber, where all eyes could see him. Daniel's heart hammered inside his chest, but he forced himself to walk with steady steps. He knew he could not show weakness now. He had seen something in the arena that gave him strength. The people had laughed, even if only for a short while. That sound had broken centuries of silence and fear. He believed that if he could turn that spark into fire, then perhaps the queen would not be able to smother it. The queen's voice rang out with sharp clarity as she declared that the human had insulted her throne and disturbed the order of her realm. She asked him to defend himself not with pleas for mercy, but with words that could explain why she should not crush him where he stood. Her tone carried both fury and curiosity. Daniel knew this was a trial not of weapons, but of words. His life depended on his ability to speak. He lifted his head and addressed her with all the strength he could gather. He said that in his world rulers were remembered not only for the power they wielded, but for the emotions they stirred in their people. He explained that fear created obedience, but also silence, and silence was the death of spirit. He said that laughter created memory and loyalty, because when people laughed together, they became a family. The translator orb carried his voice across the chamber, and the aliens shifted uneasily. Some frowned while others seemed caught by the rhythm of his speech. The queen narrowed her eyes and demanded why she should trade fear for laughter. Daniel took a breath and answered simply that fear could last a season, but joy could last generations. He told her that the laughter in the arena would echo longer in her people's hearts than any threat of death. The chamber murmured again, and Daniel saw faces beginning to change. Advisors whispered nervously because they knew his words carried a dangerous truth. The queen struck her staff on the ground, and the chamber shook. She declared that his tongue was clever, but cleverness did not erase insult. She reminded everyone that he had compared her to something small and foolish from his own world. The crowd hissed in agreement, and Daniel felt the weight of their anger pressing down again. For a moment he thought it was over. Yet then he remembered that humans did not survive by silence. They survived by daring. He lifted his voice once more and said that yes, he had called her a Smurf, because his fear had slipped into humor, but perhaps it was not an insult at all. Perhaps it was a gift. The queen tilted her head as if confused. Daniel explained that in his world the small blue beings he spoke of were not rulers, but they were beloved by children for their kindness and spirit. He said that perhaps her people could see her not only as a queen of fear, but also as a symbol of something larger than themselves. He risked everything by turning the insult into a title of honor. The chamber fell into silence. The queen's advisors looked uncertain, and even the guards shifted in place. The queen's eyes burned with cold fire as she descended from her throne and stepped closer to him. She circled him slowly as if studying prey that had surprised her. She asked him what gave humans the right to believe their strange humor could hold power here. Daniel met her gaze and said it was not about right but about truth. He said humans had survived not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they carried hope even in fear and laughter. Was the shape of that hope? The queen stopped in front of him, and the silence pressed heavy across the chamber. For a long moment, no one moved. Then she turned and raised her staff high. She announced that the human would speak one last time before the people in the arena. If he could sway their hearts, then perhaps he would live. If he failed, then his blood would mark the sand. The advisors gasped, but no one dared to argue. The queen had turned the insult into a challenge. The next day Daniel was dragged back into the vast arena. The seats overflowed with thousands of blue faces watching with restless anticipation. The queen sat upon a high throne overlooking the stage. Her voice boomed across the space, declaring that this human had mocked her, yet had also dared to speak of joy and loyalty. She said that now he would stand before them all and prove whether his strange human words held truth or only folly. If his words failed to move them, he would die by the sword. Daniel stood in the center of the arena, chains removed so that he could speak freely. He felt the vast weight of eyes upon him, but he also felt a strange calm. He remembered Earth and the countless moments when laughter had carried people through war, hunger, and despair. He remembered how even in the darkest nights humans gathered around fire and told stories that made them laugh so they could find the courage to face another day. He drew strength from those memories and raised his voice. He told the crowd that fear chained their hearts, but laughter broke chains. He told them that even in death, a human would laugh because it was the final act of freedom. He told them that when they laughed in the arena, it was not weakness, but power, because no throne could command joy. The words echoed across the vast walls, and he saw the ripple move through the crowd. Faces changed from stern to curious to uncertain smiles. The sound of laughter rose again, louder this time, rolling across the arena like thunder, yet brighter than any storm. The queen sat still upon her throne. Her expression was unreadable, but her people were no longer silent. They laughed, and for the first time in her reign, the sound did not fade. It grew and grew until even the guards could not hold their stern faces. The queen lifted her staff high, and the arena fell quiet at once. She stood tall, and her voice rang out, declaring that the trial of words was ended, and the human's fate would be spoken at dawn. Daniel was seized again and taken back to his cell, but this time the air around him felt different. He had seen the power of his words shake an entire empire. He had seen laughter rise where fear once ruled. And as he sat in the silence of his cell, he knew the queen was no longer deciding whether he would die. She was deciding whether she could live with what he had shown her. The night before the verdict stretched endlessly for Daniel as he lay inside the cell with his back pressed to the cold wall and his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the alien runes carved above him. He had spoken before thousands. He had turned their silence into laughter, and yet he did not know if that was enough to change the will of the Queen. His heart carried both hope and fear. He remembered the sound of the arena filled with joy, and it gave him strength, but he also remembered the fire in the Queen's silver eyes, and it reminded him that mercy was not a word she easily used. He thought of Earth and of how fragile life always seemed there, and he told himself that even if this was his end, then he had at least shown these beings something new. He closed his eyes and drifted in uneasy rest until the sound of footsteps woke him at dawn. The guards came with their heavy spears and sharp armor, and they unlocked the chains from the wall. Daniel stood slowly, every muscle aching from days of strain, but his spirit held firm. They marched him once again through the winding corridors of the palace until the light of morning poured over him and the roar of the arena reached his ears. When he stepped out onto the sand, the vast sea of blue faces greeted him with anticipation. Some looked curious, some looked hopeful, and some looked fearful, but none looked indifferent. He knew then that he had already made an imprint on their hearts. At the far end of the arena, the Queen sat on her high throne, her sapphire form gleaming under the rising sun. She lifted her staff and silence spread through the crowd. Her voice rolled across the arena with regal power. She told her people that this human had insulted her throne, yet he had also dared to speak of things her realm had never known. He had spoken of laughter and hope, and he had stirred feelings that had long been buried. Now, she said, the time had come to decide his fate. Daniel stood tall, though his body trembled inside. The Queen's gaze met his, and for a long moment neither moved. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the words that would decide his life. The Queen spoke again, saying that a ruler must be strong. A ruler must never allow weakness, and laughter was seen as weakness in her land. The people murmured in agreement, their voices low and uncertain. Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath him, as though the moment was slipping from his hands. But then the Queen raised her hand to silence them once more, and her tone changed. She said that a ruler must also be wise. She had seen how laughter had shaken her people, how it had broken silence and filled the air with energy no sword or decree had ever created. She said perhaps it was not weakness but another kind of strength. She turned her eyes back to Daniel and told him that she would not kill him. His life was spared not because he was strong with weapons or feared by armies, but because he had revealed something even fear could not control. The crowd erupted into gasps and shouts. Some cheered while others protested, but the Queen silenced them all with a strike of her staff. She declared that from this day forward laughter would not be seen as dishonor, but as spirit, a fire that belonged to her people as much as strength did. She said the human had shown them this fire and that his life would be spared. Yet she warned Daniel never to insult her again, for her mercy would not extend twice. Relief washed through him so strongly that he almost collapsed. The crowd filled the arena with voices, some shouting joy, others confusion, but none could deny the change. Daniel was escorted back from the stage, no longer as a condemned man but as one who had altered the fate of an empire. Later, when he sat once again in the smaller chamber, the servant girl brought him water. Her eyes shone with awe as she whispered that the city was alive with noise, that people laughed in the streets and repeated his strange word as though it carried magic. Daniel almost smiled at the thought of aliens whispering Smurf with delight. He thanked her quietly and knew that while his future among them was uncertain, he had already left a mark that would not fade. Queen summoned him once more before her throne. She studied him long and hard, her silver eyes piercing but less harsh than before. She told him that she did not trust him, that humans were still unknown, but she could not deny the power he had revealed. She said she would allow him to live among them for a time, not as a prisoner, but not as a free man either. He would be watched and tested. If he proved that his people carried more than foolish words, then perhaps one day he would stand before her as an equal. Daniel bowed slightly, careful with his words, and promised he would show her that humanity's spirit was not weakness. Inside he felt both exhausted and alive. He had faced execution and turned it into survival through nothing but words and courage. He thought of Earth again and of all the times humans had laughed in the face of despair. That was the true strength of his kind, and now even here on a distant world, it had saved him. As he was led from the throne chamber, he heard the faint sound of laughter echoing through the palace halls. It was not mocking laughter nor cruel, but genuine and free. He smiled to himself and whispered that humans always found a way. The sun set that evening over the alien city, and Daniel watched from his small chamber high in the palace tower. He saw groups of blue figures gathered in the streets below, some retelling the story, others laughing together as if for the first time in their lives. He leaned against the stone railing and felt a strange peace settle over him. He knew the danger was not gone, that the queen could still turn against him, that he was far from home. But he also knew that he had proven one truth, a truth that gave humanity its place among the stars. Humans might be weak in body. They might be fragile compared to the towering species of the galaxy, but they carried something no empire could crush. They carried laughter, the simple act of defying fear with joy. And sometimes that was enough to change a world. Daniel whispered softly to himself that it had all begun with one foolish word spoken in fear. One word that almost killed him and yet had given him life. He smiled at the memory and let the sound of laughter drifting up from the city fill his ears. Whatever tomorrow brought, he was ready, because he knew now that even in the darkest halls of an alien throne, laughter could still echo. And as long as it echoed, humanity would never be powerless. And